So as we move into the modern age, one name stands out prominently, and that is René Descartes. So Descartes was a French philosopher. He was born in 1596. He died in 1650. So this is 17th century French philosophy. And the school of thought to which Descartes belongs is called continental rationalism. It's continental because it comes from the continent. Um, the British used the expression "the continent" to speak about Europe, to separate themselves from the rest of Europe. So continental means European, and rationalism means the light of reason. So the big movement that took place after the Renaissance, it actually grew out of the Renaissance, is called the Enlightenment. And words take on meaning in context. I've said that so many times, and it's so important. So the word enlightenment, when used to speak about a historical epoch in our Western tradition, it has nothing to do with the idea of enlightenment that comes from the Far East, like in Hinduism and Buddhism, that the Buddha was enlightened. In fact, the word Buddha means enlightenment. So it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the light of reason, the natural light of reason, as they called it. So this is a very important moment it's not a moment, an actual age that took place at the dawn of the 17th century. And it's called the Enlightenment. And it gave rise to modern science, optometry, so many gifts that came from the Enlightenment. I mean, it's hard to overestimate the practical implications and utility of this movement. And Descartes, the way I picture him, he holds the torch to herald in this new age called the Enlightenment. And we people living in the 21st century, we are the children of the Enlightenment. And now we're moving into what some call the postmodern era, but we're still very modern. So this is the dawning of the modern age. And it gave rise to, all the advances in medicine and science and in so many other things. Now, Descartes was right at the forefront of that. And his philosophy came to be called Cartesian, from the last part of his name, Descartes. So they make an adjective out of his name, Cartesian. And as his philosophy began to develop, it spread throughout Europe incredibly, and it just dominated the European world. Then there were some other thinkers who even surpassed Descartes, and this movement of the Enlightenment in England and in the UK and Scotland and other places. There was a movement called British empiricism, where they emphasized the importance of sensory experience and experience as the basis of everything. But on Descartes, this other school of thought that was moving parallel to that is called continental rationalism, as I said, heralded in by René Descartes. And they emphasize reason above empirical experience. And then came this great movement that attempt to synthesize both sides, and it's called German idealism. Immanuel Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and then it reaches its apex in this great philosophy of Hegel. So that's just a little background in the intellectual history. So Descartes came to be known as the father of modern philosophy, René Descartes. So he lived, as I said, from 1596, and he died in 1650 at the early age of 53. So he wrote many books, and perhaps the most important one is his Metaphysics, which is the study of reality, and it's called Meditations on First Philosophy. Now, the reason it's called, it's really not a meditation. My understanding of meditation comes from the Far East, where you actually stop your mind from moving, and it's a whole different tradition. But Descartes uses the word meditation, but he's thinking. It's really contemplation, but he calls it meditation. And first philosophy, the reason he calls it first philosophy is following Aristotle, who claimed that metaphysics is first philosophy because it studies first principles, first in the sense that it's the foundation of everything else. So meditations on first philosophy, this is Descartes' metaphysics. And I just want to cover with you the first two meditations and extract from that Descartes' view of human nature. And secondly, I'm going to take some liberties to not really critically respond to it, but I just want to bring out some implications that are implicit in Descartes' theory of human nature, and just leave it at that without any kind of judgment about it. So I'm going to bring out the implications of his theory of human nature. So let's look into these first two meditations. So I want to say one more thing, though, before we go to the text. By the time Descartes comes on the scene, there was growing in the nations of Europe this growing sense of skepticism. And what skepticism means in philosophy is that philosophers that came before were being dogmatic. And dogmatism means you make claims that you really have no support for the claims. And skepticism argues that it's impossible to gain any kind of certainty regarding first principles. So Descartes was born into that intellectual milieu. The other thing about the age that Descartes was born into is there was a movement to go beyond the faith-based thinking of the Middle Ages. And they wanted to begin to think about what can be proven with the light of reason. So, for example, that the human soul is immortal, that God exists. These things are, before the modern age, were considered articles of faith. So you can't really prove that God exists, or you can't really prove that the soul is immortal. But Descartes sets out to prove that. So Descartes claims that he had a series of dreams, and a vision came to him and said, you, René Descartes, will be the one who lays the solid foundations for the sciences. And by sciences, he means not just natural science, but any body of thought that can be what's the word I'm looking for? That can be proven. So he needs a solid starting point, like Archimedes, the great Greek inventor and philosopher, claimed he could move the universe if he could just find one solid point to start everything. And so Descartes wanted to be like Archimedes, only not with the physical world, but with the metaphysical world. He wanted to found a foundation for the sciences. The other thing about Descartes is when he was educating himself, going through this very rigorous Jesuit education, he was always skeptical of the knowledge that he was gaining, because it couldn't be proven. But the one body of thought that he did feel certain about was mathematics. And he became a great mathematician. You might know the Cartesian coordinates from analytic geometry. Those are called Cartesian after naming after Rene Descartes. When they plot like quadratic equations in a y and x axis, what Descartes did is synthesized geometry with algebra and came up with analytic geometry. And so until today, we use the Cartesian coordinates. So Descartes was a great mathematician too, and contributed much to the discipline of mathematics. But the reason I'm talking about mathematics is that Descartes wanted that same certainty. When you say 3 and 2 are 5, you could be dreaming, you could be deceived by some malevolent, evil genius, whatever. But 3 and 2 are going to remain 5. And a square is going to have only 4 sides. So the geometry and arithmetic, mathematics in general, is certain. And what Descartes wanted is the same certainty that one can have in mathematics. He wanted to develop a basis for that same kind of certainty in metaphysics. And that became a hallmark of the modern world. It's the very reason why today we look for certainty in the sciences. And we go in modern science, its rigor depends on the certainty, okay? Like today during the pandemic, we go into the third phase of research on a vaccine, and there's experiments being done, and it takes a long time to do it right. And that's because we want certainty. We want to know it's effective, and we want to know it's safe. So, but the very rigor of natural science is based on the quest for certainty. Years ago, when I began to study, I used to like to take the word philosophy and the word philos and sophia, and it changes depending on what philosopher you're talking about. The philos takes on a certain meaning, and the sophia part takes on a certain meaning. With Descartes, the philos part of the word philos sophia, which means philosophy, the philos is the quest for certainty. And that became a hallmark for the modern world. And the Sophia part has to do with certainty concerning God, the human soul, and the material world. So this is Descartes' task, to develop a system of philosophy and a methodology. He did great work on methods. His first work was called Rules for the Direction of the Mind, and it's his work on methodology. So philosophy for Descartes is the quest for certainty concerning God, the human soul, and the material world. And the assumptions that Descartes put into our thinking became part of the very way we see reality. You know, one of the things I've noticed as a philosopher all these years, that these great philosophers, their ideas, they seep into our world, and they begin to shape the way we see the world. Like, for example, you know, animals have very little rights, and they haven't had rights for a long time. Well, that's based on the assumption that animals don't have a soul. If they had a soul, then they would have rights. So there's a very intimate connection between philosophical ideas and the way we live our world, our being in the world, what we consider to be normal and what we consider to be abnormal. And I've made it my task to look at that connection throughout. So I'm going to bring out some connections here, some implications without making any judgments about them, and just leave it at that so that you'll be aware about that. But let's go over the first two meditations then. So how is Descartes going to develop this system of certainty concerning God, the human soul, and the material world? Well, he comes up with this ingenious method of starting. Instead of allowing doubt to plague him and lead him to skepticism, he's going to take this doubt and turn it into something that will be useful, okay? So his method in the first meditation is this. He's going to take every body of knowledge and try to conjure up the least, the most, any doubt that can be applied to its foundation, because it's impossible to go through everything in his mind, because there's so much knowledge in our mind. It would be an infinite project. So it's impossible to doubt all the knowledge that any human being has in their mind. That would be an infinite project. But if you can doubt the foundation upon a body of knowledge, then the whole edifice would fall. Like in the physical world, if you destroy the foundation of a building, then the whole building comes falling down. So he's going to take this doubt, which came to be called methodological doubt. It's not really doubt in the sense of doubting yourself or anything. Again, words take on meaning in context. So we're thinking about this methodological doubt that Descartes uses in Meditation 1. Okay, so you have to always know who said it and in the context. So it's Descartes' doubt, and it's how he uses the word in Meditation 1. By the way, I know I keep saying this ad nauseum, but without this, everything gets blurry and muddy. So this helped me a lot to make sense of philosophy. Always return words to who said it and in the context. Okay, so what does Descartes mean by methodological doubt? Well, that's what I'm talking about. He's going to take all these different bodies of knowledge that there can be, and he's going to conjure up, use his imagination, use whatever means he can to find any reason for doubting the foundation of that body of thought. And if he can doubt that body of thought, then he's going to assume that that whole body of thought, that whole body of knowledge that he's doubting, it doesn't exist. And the reason he's doing that is because he's trying to find something that's indubitable. It's a very Cartesian word. Indubitable means beyond doubt. Another word that I learned by studying Descartes is apodictic, which is, no one uses that word actually. It's one of those fancy philosophical words, but it's a bona fide word in our English language. It means beyond doubt, apodictic, or indubitable. So he's looking for that starting point, like Archimedes, could have that one starting point that's immovable, and he could move the universe, he says. So what is that starting point? Well, he goes through in Meditation 1, he systematically doubts all these bodies of knowledge. So the first body of knowledge that he doubts is what comes through the senses. We have 5 senses, and we move into the world, and we experience the sensuous world. We have experience. We have, as they call it, sensory experience or experience. So we have perceptions and sensations. So the reason he sets forth to doubt, now you can't doubt every perception you have, you'd be here forever. You can't even live that long. So you can doubt the very foundations of that whole body of knowledge that comes to us through our 5 senses. And the reason he gives for doubting that is that our senses deceive us. When we look up at the moon, it looks like it's as big as a quarter. And if I see somebody far away, they look very small. Or if my hands are cold and I put it in lukewarm water, the water feels really almost hot. So, or sometimes I see somebody that I think is my friend, and it's some stranger, and I wave and I feel a little ridiculous because it's not him. So I make mistakes, and our senses have deceived us. So the reason we know that the moon is not as big as a quarter is our reason. If we rely just on our senses, then it's as big as a quarter. So since the senses have deceived us in the past and continue to deceive us, then we can doubt that whole body of knowledge. So boom, in one swipe, the whole material world just falls into oblivion because he can doubt it. Again, the doubt has utility, and the utility is he's trying to find that one thing that can't be doubted, or perhaps he can become certain that nothing is certain, which is a kind of certainty really, but that's not the kind of certainty he's looking at, because that would be the certainty of skepticism. and he wants to move beyond skepticism. The whole modern age is the attempt to move beyond skepticism. So, okay, now the material world doesn't exist, assuming that in the context of his methodological doubt. The next thing he doubts then is his own awareness of his own self. Here I am, dressed in this white gown, sitting by this fire in the wintertime. You know, he sets that all up and describes that to his reader. Looks at his hands, looks at his body. Here I am, René Descartes. Can I doubt that? Well, again, he uses any means he can to find any iota of doubt. It could be that he's dreaming. Now, there is a difference between dreams and conscious awareness when we wake up. But sometimes our dreams do have strong force of reality. At times, I even remember sometimes dreaming, and you really don't know if you're dreaming. You know, there's lucid dreaming where you know you're dreaming, but sometimes that lucidity gets clouded and you start thinking that the dream is real. So Descartes really plays on that. He says, sometimes I dream things and I think it's happening for real, and it's really just a dream, but I don't know it's a dream because of the strong force of reality of that dream. So it could be that I'm really not Descartes. It could be somebody else dreaming I'm Descartes. So he doubts his own body and his own self-awareness. The next thing he doubts in meditation 1, he says, suppose I am dreaming, but these things that I experience in my dreams, even though I've doubted the whole material world, these things that I'm dreaming, they're not complete. They're not completely made up by me. Like I may dream of giraffes, or I may dream of balloons, or whatever. So there are giraffes and balloons, but they're going on inside of my head. And so he moves from what came to be called secondary qualities to primary qualities. Secondary qualities are the actual sensuous experiences that we're having, like the colors and the sounds of things. The primary qualities are the causes of those sensory sounds and colors and smells and tastes and sense of touch. There's a mathematical reality. Like, for example, if I hear a sound, if I hear the tone of A in music or anywhere, just that tone that came to be called A, it's really vibrating. It's really air vibrating 440 times in 1 second. So that vibration of the air 440 times in 1 second, that's the condition for the possibility of that tone, A. That's the tone usually musicians use. When you hear an orchestra, you know, tuning up, they all play the A, and they all, I think it's 440 or it's 880. No, I think it's 440, whatever it is. The number that of vibrations is the cause of that tone. So there's a difference between the tone and the number that caused the tone. They're really the same thing. It's just different body of knowledge. So the tone itself is called secondary qualities, and the cause for the tone came to be called primary qualities. Now, Descartes doesn't make that distinction between secondary and primary qualities. He doesn't say those words, but that's what he's doing. He's making that distinction. So what about the primary qualities, like the vibrations of 440 times in a second? Even though I may be dreaming that, those primary qualities must be real. And that leads him, he says, whether I'm awake or asleep, 2 plus 3 equals 5. Whether I'm awake or asleep, 2 plus 3 added together are 5, and a square has no more than 4 sides. So now he's moved into the mathematical, the primary qualities. How can that be doubted? Even if I'm dreaming, 3 and 2 are 5, and a square has 4 sides, even in my dreams. So how can that be doubted? And that leads him to think that perhaps God made humans such that we would constantly deceive ourselves. Now, later on in one of the later meditations, he's going to, I'm going to get over here out of the sun a little bit. He's going to show that God can't be a deceiver because deception is a form of weakness and God is all powerful, so he would never create us to be constantly deceived. So in order to guard himself against saying anything negative about God, in this first meditation, he moves on to talk about an evil genius. Not God, but some very powerful, malevolent spirit that came to be called the evil genius. Maybe the devil he has in mind, but he doesn't use the word Satan or devil. He just calls him an evil genius. Or some people call it hyperbolic doubt, where that means that there could be this malevolent spirit that constantly deceives us to thinking that 3 and 2 are 5, or that a square has 4 sides, or the truths of mathematics. So he writes, I will suppose, therefore, that not God, who is supremely good and the source of truth. See, he's guarding himself against that. Later on, he'll prove that God would never make us to deceive ourselves, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all of his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and external things are merely the delusions of dreams, which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. Okay, so now he's virtually doubted everything. He's doubted the material world, that he's his own self-awareness, the validity of his ego, namely his self-awareness, secondary qualities, primary qualities, and mathematical truths, which are the most certain of thoughts that anyone could have in their minds. He's doubted everything. So he ends, I am like a prisoner who is enjoying an imaginary freedom while asleep, as if he begins to suspect that he is asleep. He dreads being woken up and goes along with the pleasant illusion as long as he can. In the same way, I happily slide back into my old opinions. In other words, what he's talking about there at the end of meditation 1 is that he's slipping back into the natural attitude, this ordinary way of being in the world, before he begins to doubt everything. Because it's easy, as soon as you open your eyes, you assume that the empirical world is real, that there are these mathematical truths. And so he's fighting what came to be called the natural attitude, rather than this philosophical posture that he's trying to develop. So that's how meditation 1 ends. Meditation 2, this is where one of the most famous ideas in philosophy was first expressed. He starts it this way. So serious are the doubts into which I have been thrown as a result of yesterday's meditation that I can neither put them out of my mind nor see any way of resolving them. It feels as if I've fallen unexpectedly into a deep whirlpool which tumbles me around so that I can neither stand on the bottom nor swim at the top. Nevertheless, I will make an effort and once more attempt the same path which I started yesterday. Anything which admits of the slightest doubt, I will set aside, just as I had found it to be wholly false, and I will proceed in this way until I recognize something certain, or, if nothing else, until I recognize for certain that there is no certainty. And here's where he mentions Archimedes. Archimedes used to demand just one firm and immovable point in order to shift the entire earth. So I, too, can hope for great things if I manage to find just one thing, however slight, that is certain and indubitable. So he needs this starting point. By the way, before we move on, here's his thinking. If he can have this certain starting point, then he can use deductive reasoning, which is invented by Aristotle, which is just a magnificent way of thinking. With deductive reasoning, if you have premises which are supporting your conclusion, and if those premises are true, and the argument, the deductive argument is valid, that what that means is, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true also. Like, for example, if I say all humans are mortal, Socrates is a man, if you accept those two premises, then you have to accept the fact that Socrates is mortal. So that's the beauty of deductive arguments. If the premises are true, the conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises. And with the way Descartes is thinking, he wants to develop a system that includes everything and base it on this indubitable starting point, and then argue deductively and bring the world back. So he's eliminated the world now, right? He's living in this whirlpool, as he says, and there's nothing certain. He's going to come up with it right now, in fact. But his thinking is that if he can have this starting point that's indubitable, then he could use deductive reasoning and bring the world back, body of thought by body of thought, systematically, and bring it all back again: God, the soul, the material world, everything, the immortality of the soul, everything that he's denied. And it will have this edifice that's unshakable. It'll be based on deductive reasoning and founded on an indubitable starting point. So that's his goal. So what is this indubitable starting point? Well, it came to be called the cogito, C-O-G-I-T-O. The word cogito in Latin just means I think. But it's really cogito sum. Cogito, comma, sum. Now, it came to be called cogito ergo sum. Ergo means therefore. But and that's how he says it in another book, The Rules for the Direction of the Mind. But in the meditation, where he first expresses the famous cogito, he doesn't use the word ergo. And the reason he doesn't use the word ergo means therefore, is this. If the starting point, cogito, namely I think, leads to sum, which means I am in Latin, if it's an argument, then the cogito is a premise and the sum is the conclusion. Well, then he would have to prove the premises. Okay? The thinking, he would have to prove the certainty of thinking. And then you would have to prove the premises that prove the certainty of thinking. Then you would have to prove the premises that prove the certainty of the proofs of thinking. And it would go back ad infinitum. There'd be no starting point. So the starting point has to be not an argument, because all arguments have premises, which are the support for the conclusion. Then you would have to support the support, and then support the support of the support, and it would go back ad infinitum. He knows this. So he takes the word ergo out, which means therefore. There's going to be a lot of ergos after that, but this starting point can't be an argument, because if it is, then the premises would have to be proven. So the starting point can't be proven. It has to be an intuition. And he uses the word intuition in a very specific way. That's a very important word in my philosophy. I take other philosophers use the word intuition very differently. So again, the word has to be returned to Descartes. So he doesn't put cogito ergo sum. He just says cogito, comma, sum. I think, I am. And what he means by that is this. If he's doubting everything, even if he doubts his own existence, even if he's dreaming, even if some malevolent demon is making him be delusionary about so-called certain truths of mathematics, even if he's doubting his own existence, he's doubting. And in order for there to be doubt, there has to be someone who's doubting. So you can't doubt your own existence, because as soon as you doubt your own existence, there you are, assuming that you exist. So he could have said, dubito ergo sum, I doubt, therefore I am. But doubting is a form of thinking. So he just says it more universally, cogito sum. And that's the starting point. And he makes a big deal about that. It's impossible to doubt his own existence. So after considering everything very thoroughly, I must finally conclude that this proposition, I am, I exist, that means sum in Latin, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. Okay, so that's the starting point. That's called the famous cogito. Okay, it's important. Sometimes when I teach this face-to-face, I don't tell the students, and some people haven't read it yet, so they don't really know the answer. And I just say, figure it out. If you're doubting your own existence, is there anything that can't be doubted? And usually somebody puts their hand up. It's not rocket science. In order to doubt, you have to exist. At least that's an assumption. So even if you're doubting your own existence, you have to exist. So it's impossible to doubt your own existence. So this is the certainty of one's own existence. Now, here's the part where it touches on philosophy of human nature. What am I? I know that I am. Let's pretend we're Descartes. I know that I am, at least when I'm thinking. It could be when I'm not thinking, I don't exist. But as soon as I think, I exist. And for Descartes, anything going on in your mind is thinking. Okay, so if you will something, if you deny something, if you imagine something, if you conceive something, if you perceive something, thinking is still going on because you perceive it, with concepts, not just sensory experience. So anything happening in the mind is called thinking for Descartes. So what am I then? What then did I formerly think I was? A man. But what is a man? Shall I say a rational animal? He went back to Aristotle. But then he says, no, that would take me into a whole, inquiry into what is an animal and what is reason, and we don't need to deal with that. So what am I? Well, after due consideration, and you can follow the movements of his thinking, he says, I'm a thinking thing. Res cogitans. Res means thing in Latin. Cogitans means thinking. Res cogitans, a thinking thing. R-E-S, then C-O-G-I-T-A-N-S, cogitans. And then he begins to develop what is a thinking thing. Now we've touched upon his metaphysics of human nature. By the way, metaphysics is not just about the material world. Usually metaphysics talks about the soul. It talks about necessity and freedom. A lot of issues come in the study of metaphysics. So in talking about the human soul, that's still metaphysics. So this is his metaphysics of human nature. So what is a human being? A thinking thing. And what is a thinking thing? A thing. So now let's anchor on, let me do a little bit of showing the implications of this. A thing is an object. It's something, it's subjectivity, but it's subjectivity objectified. Okay? I know that sounds weird, but this thinking thing that Descartes says human beings are, that's subjectivity. But subjectivity is now being objectified. Okay, that's going to be an important assumption that finds its way into our modern consciousness. That humans are things, and a thing is an object. But he knows it's subjectivity, but now he's objectifying subjectivity. And furthermore, a thinking thing is incorporeal. So corpus means body, like Corpus Christi means the body of Christ. Corporeal means it's made of matter. So incorporeal means it has no matter. So who am I? I'm this incorporeal thinking thing. I'm subjectivity, objectified, that thinks. Now, this is my soul. Here's the big thing that I find important. And I found it in a footnote somewhere, that for Descartes, there's a footnote that says, when he talks about the mind, the human mind, he says, or the soul of man, for I make no distinction between them. That's just a little footnote on the bottom of page 383. But it's very important because here we find an important assumption that the mind is identical to the soul, that the soul is a mind. And Descartes has in mind a particular concept of mind, namely Western European deductive and inductive thinking. People of different nations, of different times, don't think in terms of deduction and induction, okay? So the very fact that he equivocates, that he uses the same word to speak of the soul of humans and the mind, means that anything that doesn't have a mind, like a human mind, doesn't have a soul. Now, this is an important implication because all the animals that I've ever encountered, some of them are pretty smart, but I know they don't think deductively and inductively. And I know they're not questioning the foundations of the sciences. You know, we can be pretty certain about that. So any creature that doesn't have a mind, like a Western European man, doesn't have a soul. So I'm going to let you think about that and think about every time one group of humans considers themselves superior to another, what do they say about those others? They say they're animals, okay? Have you ever watched movies or series when the most heinous thing someone can say about someone, like a serial killer or something, he's an animal? Now there's a double assumption there. First of all, that animals are inferior to humans. Secondly, that humans are not animals, and that it's something horrible to be an animal. And that's we even use a distinction in common language, that there are animals and that there are humans. We don't say non-human animals and the human animal. We say, I'm going to the zoo to see the animals. And we assume that humans are different from animals. All those assumptions are based on Descartes' thinking that humans are not animals, and that the human soul is mind, and that mind is a Western European male mind that thinks deductively and inductively, okay? So I'm going to stop, I'm restraining myself from launching any kind of critique. I just wanted to bring that important distinction out because that assumption came down into our world, that humans are thinking things and that the soul is identical to the mind of Western European human. And that anybody that doesn't have a mind like that, for example, Native American Indians with respect to the white man, women with respect to men, people of color with respect to white men, anytime one group of people assumes superiority over another. But let's just take one issue. Why do you think it was for so long that women couldn't vote. That's ridiculous, right? I mean, think about it. It was 100 years of protesting and work. There are documentaries on this. Finally, women's suffrage. Well, women, they're not quite human. That was the assumption. They're too emotional. There are people who think that way now. They shouldn't even be in office. That's why it was such a big deal. Why is it such a big deal that Kamala Harris is now in the highest position in the White House, second highest position in our government? Why is it such a big deal? Why for so long couldn't women just be the president? Well, there must have been this assumption that they're too emotional, they're too much like animals. So all this is implied, although Descartes doesn't go there. I'm not saying that he maliciously set up a system that gave a foundation for bigotry. But there are some connections there, you must admit, that if you identify the soul with mind, and if you have a very specific and narrow definition of mind, namely deductive and inductive thinking, according to Western European model, then anybody that doesn't think that way is an animal and not human. And that gives a foundation for bigotry. That's why people say they were animals, they're savages. They're not human. They do it in war too, in order to give there's a utility. We demonize, we thingify the enemy so that it's easier to kill them. In war, we do that. But we do that not just in war either. Whenever there's bigotry and chauvinism of any sort. All right, so enough of that. So the other thing that I want to bring out, so then he turns from soul. Remember, I told you there's three things he's trying to get certainty about: God, the human soul, and the material world. And he thinks God is the most easily known. He's going to give proofs for the existence of God. This is what later on in the meditations. In Meditations 3, he starts, and then he returns to it. Now he's talking about the human soul. But from there, he turns to the material world. So what is the material world? Well, it's in many ways just the opposite of the soul, the human soul. The material world is extension. So res extensa, res means thing, I told you. Extensa means extended. So extended means something that can be measured in breadth, depth, width, something that takes up space where something else can't take the same space. That's the material world. Now, there are assumptions there too about the material world. He claims the material world, and that includes everything that doesn't have a soul. And again, the soul is very much narrowed from ancient philosophy. Remember, in Aristotle and Plato had the world soul. All existence has a soul. Aristotle starts with plant life. There's the plant soul, the animal soul, the human soul. Now, when we move into the modern world, the only thing that has a soul are humans. So plants don't have a soul. Animals don't, non-human animals don't have a soul. The material world doesn't have a soul. And if they have no soul, then they have no rights, of course. So what is then this material world? By the way, it includes our bodies too, because our bodies are part of the natural world. So the essence of the material world is res extensa, the extended thing. Okay, so now you have these two realities: this unextended, incorporeal subjectivity that's been objectified, that's certain of itself, this thinking thing, that's human. Then you have the world, the material world, which is an extended thing, and it's corporeal, and it takes up space. Now that's called metaphysical dualism. And it means that there's two separate substances. One is incorporeal, namely the human soul, and one is corporeal, namely the material world. Actually, in Descartes' philosophy, there are three substances. God is the first and important substance. Then there's the soul of humans, and then there's the material world. So there's these three substances. By the way, by making three independent substances, he's taking God out of the material world and out of the soul of man too. Because God is one thing, the soul of man is another thing, and then the material world is another thing. There are three independent substances. So there are great implications to that too, that the material world is not only despiritualized, but it's desacralized. There's nothing sacred about the material world, and it has no soul, so it has no rights. So then what is the material world? It's just matter, and it follows the laws of physics. That includes our human bodies. Our bodies are not who we are. See, that's a very important assumption. When you look in the mirror and see yourself, that's not you, Descartes is saying. Then who am I? I'm this ego. And what is an ego? It's a mind. What is a mind? A thinking thing. So when I say I am, what I mean is my soul. And what do I mean by my soul? This thinking thing that I am, this incorporeal subjectivity that's been objectified. Now, what this does is bifurcate the world. It puts the world on one side and it puts human subjectivity on the other. That's called dualism. One of the implications that I've come upon is it makes impossible any kind of intuitive insertion of yourself into the inner life of things. It makes intuition impossible in principle, because the only thing we can do then with the world is measure it and analyze it. Okay? And so the material world just becomes an object there waiting to be used by man. And it has no rights. Okay, so these are all implications. And this is the conception of the material world that we've born into. That's why fracking is fine. You know, even Joe Biden says, no, I'm not against fracking, as though, you know, it's not just fracking, it's the whole world then becomes a big, like, gasoline station in outer space to be used by man, sitting there waiting to be used by man. It's just a extended thing. It has no soul. There's nothing sacred about it. You just use it. And it becomes just the object of utility. It's very different than, for example, the American Indian idea of nature, which is pervaded by the Great Spirit and so on. This is a uniquely Western European conception. And as technology and the Western world spreads throughout the world, it becomes the predominant view of the world that eradicates any other view. All right, so that's the material world, and that's called metaphysical dualism. One last point I'd like to make about meditation too. There's this famous wax example. The wax example is this. Okay, Descartes is in his cabin in the wintertime, dressed in this white gown, and he's talking about the material world now. What is the essence of the material world? We already said it's an extended thing. But how do we know that this is the essence of the material world? Well, he uses this example. It's called the wax example. And apparently, in those days, of course, there's no electricity yet, so they have to light up the world with fire in night. So there are candles. And the candle that he goes to still has the smell of the tallow, of the honeycomb that it was made from. And it has a certain texture. And he talks about all the secondary qualities, the smell, the texture, and so on, of the candle. And so he takes the candle and he does a little demonstration. He takes it closer to the fireplace. And as he gets close to the heat of the fire, the wax of the candle begins to melt. And finally, it's just a puddle of wax in a plate. And so he asks his reader, how do I know that this is the same wax, because everything about it has changed. All the secondary qualities have changed. The smell is different. The form is different to my eyes. The texture is different. Everything. All five, the secondary qualities that come to us through all five senses are the same. How do I know that this is the same wax? So it's not my senses. This is where he individuates himself from that movement I told you called British empiricism. It's not my senses that know this. It's my mind. It's reason, the natural light of reason. And so I know it's the same wax because it still has extension, and I'm using my mind to know the wax, not my senses. So again, here comes the natural light of reason. The other thing is there's this very strong impulse in Descartes to individuate, to separate the human being from anything material. So we are not our bodies, we're not animals, and anything, the material world is desacralized and despiritualized. There's nothing spiritual about the body, about any body, about animals, and about the material world. So these are some of the implications I find in Descartes. You can see, when I studied Descartes, and I've studied all of Descartes because I had to know Descartes for my comprehensive exams at Penn State. And I studied Descartes because I knew he was so important. But I've had a long time to think about it, and some of the implications have become common ways of thinking in our world. And postmodern thought now is an attempt in many ways to get beyond the assumptions that were placed into the world by Descartes and by the Enlightenment. It's not by accident this movement that's taking place now is called postmodern. Post means after, and modern is the Enlightenment. So we're moving now in 21st century in certain ways beyond the Enlightenment, but there's also much in the 21st century that's still Enlightenment. In fact, there's some anti-Enlightenment elements too. You know, the anti-science, the anti-intellectualism that we find going on in Washington today, that's so retro. That's like going back to the Middle Ages, you know, not even there. I don't know where there's been a denial of science like today. Hopefully that will go away. But, you know, it's a complicated state of affairs in our modern world today. Part of it is that we are children of the Enlightenment. We've assumed many of the assumptions of the Enlightenment, both good and bad. I told you there's some wonderful things. I mean, we'd all be dying of polio, you know, without the Enlightenment. And, you know, modern medicine and modern physics, you know, so many great contributions came from the Enlightenment. But also there have been, it's never all good or all bad. Things are always ambiguous. There's also, you know, other things that need to be questioned again, you know, more thoroughly. And that's this movement of postmodernism that's trying to get beyond the Enlightenment. But then there's also this ridiculous denial of science, especially in the middle of a pandemic, which I find, I can't get my head around that. I mean, how can you deny science in the middle of a global pandemic? You know, that's probably about the most silly thing, you know, not just silly, but deadly thing to do. And so, okay, so that's my thoughts on meditation 1 and 2 of René Descartes. And I think that's enough for our brief survey that we're moving so quickly, you know, at warp speed through the history of philosophy. Thanks.